They raised their glasses beneath golden chandeliers and chased the bottle into oblivion. Others woke up to blood on the floor and headlines that no longer spelled their name. Hollywood never showed you this part, but the final name on this list? His last performance ended with a trigger pull. Errol Flynn. Cirrhosis by the sea. By the end, his body was bloated, his liver shredded. But his legend? Still drunk on its own fame. In the 1930s and 40s, Errol Flynn was the embodiment of danger wrapped in charm. A swashbuckler with a sword in one hand and a drink in the other. He didn't just play pirates on screen. He lived like one after the cameras stopped rolling. His Malibu home, co-owned with fellow actor David Niven, was nicknamed Cirrhosis by the Sea. That wasn't a punchline. It was prophecy. Flynn drank with a kind of ferocity that didn't flirt with the edge. It danced on it barefoot. He'd spike oranges with vodka to sneak it on set. Doctors would visit his home and leave behind not medicine, but bottles, wrapped like prescriptions. He once wagered $500 he could bet a co-star between takes. The result? A temporary studio shutdown and a tabloid firestorm. Still, the roles kept coming. But as his face aged faster than the calendar, and directors grew tired of editing around his slurs and stumbles, the party began to rot at the center. His final years were a haze of tax issues, shaky performances, and a body that could no longer carry the weight of his vices. When he died at just 50, his autopsy read like a warning label: cirrhosis of the liver, heart disease, countless physical ailments, the kind of breakdown that doesn't happen overnight. But sip by sip, he was buried with 6 bottles of his favorite whiskey. Maybe as a joke, maybe as a tribute, maybe because, in the end, it was the only thing that never left his side. And yet, for millions, Errol Flynn will always be the man who leapt across ships, kissed danger on the mouth, and made every scene feel like a dare. But behind the curtain, he wasn't flying, he was falling, and Hollywood just kept rolling the camera. Frank Sinatra, America's drunken chief. He never needed a script to command a room, just a glass of Jack and a reason to raise it. Frank Sinatra was more than a voice. He was a movement, a swaggering storm in a tailored suit, with the power to charm presidents and terrify studio execs in the same breath. But behind the crooner's cool was a man who reportedly couldn't go a day without the bottle. Sinatra's drink of choice? Jack Daniels. 4 ice cubes, 2 fingers, a splash of water. It was his signature, both in the glass and in the damage it left behind. On stage, he was magic. Off stage, that magic sometimes turned mean. Reporters were shoved. Friends were exiled. One wrong word could spark a tirade. Colleagues whispered that you never knew which Frank you were getting, the generous gentleman or the fury behind blue eyes. He wasn't sloppy. He was sharp. That made it harder to tell when the drink was doing the talking. Those closest to him say the drinking was constant, not chaotic, but ritualistic. A glass before lunch, one more after dinner. He held court in smoky lounges until sunrise, laughing, singing, sipping, and sometimes snapping. And yet, the world never saw a fall. Sinatra didn't stumble. He didn't vanish. He lasted. Maybe because he was too powerful to fail, or maybe because no one dared intervene. Even as his temper flared and his body wore down, the myth marched on. He kept performing into his 70s, kept drinking too. When he died in 1998, he was buried in a blue suit, with a bottle of Jack placed lovingly at his side. Some said it was a joke. Others said it was the most honest thing about his legacy. Frank Sinatra sang like a god, but he drank like a man who needed to forget something. Whatever it was, he took it to the grave, glass in hand, legends at his back. Elizabeth Taylor, beauty in the bottle. She conquered the screen with violet eyes and a voice like velvet. But behind the diamonds and designer gowns, Elizabeth Taylor was quietly unraveling, glass by glass. By the time she was 50, She'd been married 7 times, hospitalized more than a dozen, and had survived more public scandals than most stars dared whisper about. But none of that compared to the private war she was fighting, one that involved the bottle, the pills, and a deep ache no spotlight could soothe. In public, she was defiant, red carpet ready, a symbol of luxury and survival. But behind closed doors, even Taylor admitted she often couldn't face the mirror, not without a drink to soften the sharpness of her own reflection. Her days became rituals of avoidance. Champagne before breakfast, a tumbler of vodka tucked into her dressing gown pocket, whispered arguments with herself before she walked on set. Friends said she often woke up in a fog, forgetting where she was or why. By the early 1980s, her health was faltering. Her marriages had all collapsed, and her legacy, though massive, was beginning to feel like something built on sand. Then came the moment that changed everything. In 1983, Elizabeth Taylor did what no one else in her position had dared. She checked herself into the Betty Ford Center, a substance rehabilitation facility. The world gasped. This wasn't a forgotten starlet or a fading heartthrob. This was Elizabeth Taylor, royalty in pearls and eyeliner, admitting she couldn't stay sober. But it was no PR stunt. Taylor stayed. She fought. She relapsed. She returned. And then she helped others do the same. The woman once best known for her beauty became a beacon for something deeper: resilience. She didn't just survive Hollywood, she cracked it open, walked through the fire, and came out with her name still intact. In the end, she helped destigmatize treatment. She lent her fame to causes that truly mattered. And she showed millions that even the most glamorous among us carry pain, and that healing, though never easy, is possible. Elizabeth Taylor didn't just face her demons. She dragged them into the light and kept walking. Montgomery Clift, the beautiful ghost. In 1949, he stood on a rooftop in the Heiress, flawless and magnetic, the future of Hollywood. Less than a decade later, Montgomery Clift was unrecognizable, a shadow chasing himself through mirrors he couldn't bear to look into. They called him the male Garbo, soft-spoken, painfully beautiful, and so immersed in his roles that directors often forgot he was acting. But the man behind the eyes was fraying, slowly, privately, until the breaking point arrived in 1956, on a winding road in Beverly Hills. He had just left Elizabeth Taylor's house when he crashed his car into a telephone pole. His jaw was broken, teeth dislodged, nose crushed. Taylor, one of the first on scene, reportedly pulled his front teeth from his throat to keep him from choking. They saved his life, but not the man he had been. After reconstructive surgery, Clift returned to acting. The studios welcomed him back, but quietly. Roles dried up. Insurance companies hesitated. Directors whispered that he wasn't reliable. What they meant was, he couldn't stay sober. Friends noticed the change. He drank to sleep. He drank to speak. Sometimes, he barely spoke at all. The crash had altered more than his appearance. It had shattered his sense of control. On set, he would disappear into corners between takes. Off set, he retreated from the world. Scripts piled up. So did empty bottles. And yet, in the middle of that storm, he delivered some of his most haunting work. Judgment at Nuremberg, Wild River, Freud. His eyes no longer sparkled, but they burned. Elizabeth Taylor never left his side. She defended him, comforted him, reminded him of who he had once been. But even she couldn't protect him from the spiral. By the early 1960s, Clift was frail, withdrawn, and reportedly drinking heavily just to get through the day. He died in 1966 at just 45, alone in his townhouse. No drama, no final role, just silence. Montgomery Clift didn't vanish in one moment. He faded, quietly and beautifully, like a candle burning from the inside out. And Hollywood, so eager to crown him, barely whispered his name when he was gone. Peter O'Toole woke up in Corsica, meant to be in Paris. He once said, "I was a professional drinker, And he meant it. The way most men say they were surgeons or pilots. Peter O'Toole didn't sip, he devoured. He approached alcohol with the same intensity he brought to his roles. Poetic, precise, and utterly consuming. By the time he filmed Lawrence of Arabia in the early 60s, he was already building a reputation. Handsome, sharp-tongued, and restless. During production, he and co-star Omar Sharif reportedly drank their way through the Middle East, downing liquor to numb the pain of camel saddles and desert days that felt like fever dreams. But the real chaos began when the curtain closed. O'Toole was the kind of man who woke up in Corsica, not knowing how he'd gotten there, when all he remembered was a pub in Paris. Stories followed him like shadows. Tales of him showing up to strangers' funerals by accident, or disappearing for days in cities he couldn't name. He was charming, even when he was unraveling. But underneath the wit and the whiskey, there was a man allegedly battling severe health issues tied to his drinking: internal bleeding, stomach trouble, rapid weight loss. Doctors warned him to quit. He didn't. Instead, he doubled down. He once joked that his body was a badly wired house, and every drink was a flickering bulb. But the wiring held longer than anyone expected. In the late 1970s, O'Toole was hospitalized, told his liver couldn't take much more. Friends feared the end was near, and yet he pulled back, slowed down, and managed to step away from the bottle just enough to keep going. Not everyone gets that window. He did. What's astonishing is that even through it all, he delivered performance after performance that critics still study today. 8 Oscar nominations, a knighthood, a life lived at full volume, even when the voice behind it was running dry. He died in 2013, aged 81, not in a gutter, not in a blaze, but quietly, after a long, improbable stretch of survival. Peter O'Toole's life was a riddle wrapped in elegance and excess, and somehow, against every odd, the man who drank like he had nothing to lose ended up with a legacy no one could take away. Ava Gardner, tequila, bullfights, and no regrets. In Mexico, she once skipped a night shoot to drink tequila with the director, then dared him to outdrink her. That was Ava Gardner. Wild, magnetic, and devastatingly self-possessed. She wasn't just the most beautiful woman in the world. She was the kind of woman who made rules just to break them. By the 1950s, she had become Hollywood royalty, not because she played the game, but because she refused to. She walked through sets like a storm, raw, reckless, and glittering. Lovers came and went. So did husbands. Her marriage to Frank Sinatra was a whirlwind of passion, broken glass, and whispered calls in the night. Even he once said Ava was the one. But the glamour came with gravity. The bottle became her constant. Sometimes wine, sometimes whiskey, often both. Friends said she drank not to forget, but to feel everything louder. She once admitted, "I either drink too much or not at all. I can't handle moderation." On set, she'd show up late, glass in hand, daring anyone to challenge her. She could be brilliant or barely there. Directors learned to adjust. On the filming of The Night of the Iguana, she reportedly refused to shoot a key scene, telling John Huston she'd rather keep drinking. Huston sat with her, matching her drink for drink, until they were both too far gone to care. They shot the scene the next day. Her legend grew, even as her roles faded. By the 1970s, Ava had moved to London. Her health was deteriorating. She struggled with mobility and, according to close friends, never fully left the bottle behind. But here's the part that stings and somehow uplifts. Even when her body began to betray her, she refused pity. She didn't ask to be saved. She once said, "I wish to live until the last moment." And she did. No apologies, no rewrites. She passed in 1990 at age 67, quietly, alone in her London apartment, but she never faded from memory. Ava Gardner didn't break under pressure. She cracked the mold, then toasted to it. And somewhere, in a bar no longer open, someone's still raising a glass in her name. If you're enjoying this walkthrough of old Hollywood, consider subscribing. It really helps support this kind of storytelling. Now, on to Judy Garland. Judy Garland, the studio's most tragic investment. She was just 16 when they turned her into property, polished, powdered, and sold to the world as America's sweetheart. But Judy Garland wasn't built for the system that claimed her, and as she grew up under its lights, it became clear she wasn't supposed to survive it. Her breakout in The Wizard of Oz made her a star overnight. But behind the curtain, the pressure was unbearable. Executives at MGM controlled her every move. What she wore, what she weighed, when she slept, and especially when she didn't. She was given pills to keep her going. Pills to calm her down. A relentless cycle disguised as care. And through it all, the bottle waited quietly in the wings, ready to fill the silence when the applause stopped. By the time Judy reached her 20s, she was already struggling to stay sober. Her voice still soared, but her spirit cracked. On set, she'd sometimes show up shaking. Other times, not at all. Studios knew and kept the cameras rolling anyway. Her marriage to director Vincente Minnelli gave her a daughter, Liza, but couldn't give her peace. Neither could the next 4 husbands. The spotlight that once made her shine now burned her raw. She was let go from MGM in 1950. She attempted comebacks, and some were brilliant, but they never lasted. As the years passed, the finances crumbled. So did her health. At times, she couldn't afford groceries or rent. The woman who had made millions for studios was reportedly performing for loose change in London nightclubs just to stay afloat. Still, she sang. Still, she gave everything she had left. Her final performances were haunting. Not because she missed a note, but because every note sounded like a cry for help. In 1969, at just 47, Judy Garland was found in her London apartment, the result of what officials called an incautious, self-administered dose of medication. She died quietly, far from Oz, far from the cameras, and far from the childhood they never let her outgrow. Judy wasn't lost. She was used until there was nothing left but a memory and a melody. And even now, her voice still echoes, not just in music, but in warning. Richard Burton, Shakespeare in Vodka. He once said, "I have to think hard to name an interesting man who does not drink." And for a time, Richard Burton made it seem like brilliance and the bottle were one and the same. Born with a thunderous voice and the soul of a poet, Burton became the face of classical drama on screen. Larger than life, thunder in his blood, fire in his words. But behind the stage curtain and velvet voice, he was fighting a quieter war. One he was rarely sober enough to win. By the time he starred in Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, he was reportedly drinking so heavily that his co-stars could smell it on his breath between takes. Still, the performance was magnetic, raw, tortured, unforgettable. That was the paradox of Burton. The more he drank, the more captivating he became. At least, for a while. He married Elizabeth Taylor not once, but twice. Their love story was the stuff of legends, and also a battlefield. Champagne-fueled evenings blurred into shouting matches, diamond gifts followed by public breakups. Their fights made headlines. Their reconciliations sold papers. Through it all, the bottle remained a third partner in the relationship, always present, always whispering. Burton himself once claimed he was sober on 2 bottles of vodka a day. It was only when he reached 3 that things started to spiral. Directors would block scenes around his condition, adjusting to whether he was lucid, lethargic, or lost in thought. Crews waited, co-stars adapted, because even through the fog, he could still deliver lines like lightning. But the cost was immense. Years of heavy drinking took their toll. He developed liver and kidney complications. Friends said he aged faster than he lived. By the time he reached his mid-50s, the spark in his eyes had dimmed, and the voice that once shook theaters had grown hoarse. He passed in 1984 at the age of 58. No final monologue, just silence. Richard Burton's greatest role may have been pretending he was in control. And in the end, the man who spoke Shakespeare better than anyone of his generation could not outtalk the bottle. Mary Astor, The Diary, The Breakdown, The Bottle. She won an Oscar for The Great Lie. But the real drama was in a diary the public was never meant to read. Mary Astor was elegance personified in Hollywood's golden age. Her roles had poise, wit, and emotional depth. But off-screen, her life was teetering between scandal and survival. In 1936, during a brutal custody battle with her ex-husband, Astor's private diary was leaked to the press. The pages revealed not just names, but the raw thoughts of a woman unfiltered. Her affairs, her regrets, her quiet rage against the system that polished her smile but crushed her voice. The trial became a national sensation. She was shamed, humiliated, and nearly blacklisted. But she didn't back down. She returned to the screen, won awards, and tried to rebuild. Yet something had shifted. The bottle became a quiet companion, a way to blur the judgment, the whispers, the headlines that never stopped reminding her of what she'd dared to write. By the 1940s, she was reportedly drinking daily, starting in the morning, continuing through dinner. Friends said she tried to hide it, wrapping the bottle in paper bags or pouring liquor into teacups. But the strain showed. She began missing work. Her once steady hands trembled. The studios that once prized her now kept their distance. In 1949, it all collapsed. Astor checked herself into a sanitarium after a public breakdown. She later admitted that she had tried everything to quiet the noise in her head. Faith, work, even prayer. But nothing muted it like the drink. It was there, within those institutional walls, that she found a kind of clarity. Through faith, therapy, and the guidance of recovery programs, she clawed her way back, not just to health, but to dignity. She returned to acting in smaller roles, wrote 2 memoirs, and even penned several novels. Quietly, without applause, she lived out her later years sober and grounded. Mary Astor's greatest performance wasn't on screen. It was learning how to live after they tried to write her off. And though the bottle nearly stole her story, in the end, she picked up the pen and finished it herself. Barbara Payton. Beauty to brokenness. In 1951, she had it all. The face of a goddess, a contract with Universal, and a future that looked bulletproof. Just 3 years later, Barbara Payton was blacklisted, bankrupt, and sleeping in strangers' apartments just to get by. Her fall wasn't slow. It was stunning. Barbara wasn't just beautiful. She was undeniable. Men fought over her, literally. Actor Tom Neal famously brawled with her fiancé Franchot Tone, leaving Tone hospitalized and Payton in the headlines for all the wrong reasons. The scandal scorched her reputation. But instead of walking away, the press circled, and Barbara spiraled. Studios distanced themselves. Roles dried up. The bottle moved in. By the mid-1950s, she was reportedly drinking daily, appearing disoriented on set, and missing meetings altogether. She tried to claw her way back with tabloid interviews and low-budget films, but the offers shrank, and so did her income. Desperate and barely surviving, Payton began selling herself on the streets of Los Angeles. This wasn't rumor. It was reality, confirmed years later by those who saw her sitting outside liquor stores or wandering Hollywood Boulevard in heels that no longer fit right. She wasn't even 40. In 1963, she published a raw, brutally honest memoir titled I Am Not Ashamed. It chronicled the highs, the humiliations, and the loneliness of being discarded by the very town that once worshipped her. The title wasn't defiant. It was heartbreaking. Friends said she still smiled when people recognized her, still posed for photos when asked. But the sparkle was gone. Her body, once insured by studios, now showed the toll of the bottle, of poverty, and of promises broken too many times. Barbara Payton died in 1967 at just 39. The cause was listed as heart and liver failure. But the real cause was what Hollywood does when it's finished with someone. It looks away. She didn't just fall from grace. She was dropped. And all that remained was a woman still clinging to fragments of a life she was once promised, in a city that never bothered to look back. William Holden fell, bled, and died alone. He played rugged, magnetic men, the kind who walked into a room and owned it without saying a word. But William Holden's final scene didn't take place on a soundstage. It happened alone, behind the closed doors of a modest apartment, with no camera, no crowd, and no one coming to save him. In the 1950s, Holden was a titan. Sunset Boulevard, Stalag 17, the bridge on the River Kwai. He delivered performances with grit and a deep, simmering sadness that felt too real to be acting. That sadness, it turns out, ran off-screen as well. Throughout his career, Holden allegedly struggled to control his drinking. On set, he was known for arriving late, sometimes slurring his lines, sometimes avoiding press entirely. Studios didn't intervene. He was still box office gold. So the drinking continued. By the 1970s, the cracks were harder to hide. Friends said he often isolated himself, preferring the company of his bottle to the demands of stardom. He remained charismatic, but distant. A man who had once filled theaters, now avoided interviews, skipped events, and kept the curtains drawn tight. Then came November 1981. Holden was alone in his Santa Monica apartment when he reportedly fell. Some say he slipped on a rug. Others suggest he was trying to dress and lost his balance. His head struck a sharp object. He never called for help. Maybe he couldn't. Maybe he didn't want to. He was found days later, surrounded by blood-soaked bedding, with empty bottles nearby. The cause? Massive bleeding from the wound, left untreated for far too long. The irony? He had once narrated a film that opened with a dead body in a pool. A man forgotten by Hollywood until it was too late. In real life, Holden's ending was even quieter. No pool, no spotlight, just silence. William Holden didn't go out in flames. He faded in the dark. And for a man who gave so much of himself to the screen, it's haunting to realize, in the end, there wasn't even someone there to say goodbye. Robert Mitchum. Fists, film sets, and firewater. He had a face that didn't flinch, a voice like gravel soaked in bourbon, and a reputation that made directors both nervous and eager. Robert Mitchum wasn't just a Hollywood rebel. He was the rebellion. But while the studios loved his edge, they quietly tolerated the chaos behind it, and Mitchum gave them plenty to tolerate. By the late 1940s, he was one of the most bankable men in Hollywood. Cool, effortless, dangerous. But even at the peak of his fame, the bottle was never far from reach. Mitchum drank not just to relax, but to fuel the fire. On some sets, he'd start the day with a double. On others, he'd disappear during breaks, returning red-eyed and loose-limbed, improvising entire scenes through a haze. In 1951, things came to a head when he was arrested after being caught in the wrong place with the wrong crowd. While the headlines focused on scandal, the deeper issue lingered off-page. Mitchum couldn't stay sober. Even friends admitted that by the afternoon, he was often unreachable. On the set of His Kind of Woman, his drinking reportedly got so out of hand that crew members had to physically guide him through his scenes. He slurred dialogue, lost track of cues, and sometimes vanished entirely between takes. But he was still Robert Mitchum, still electric, still watchable. And so, the cycle continued. Off-screen, the firewater followed him home. He got into bar fights, missed premieres. There were rumors of him sleeping on park benches after all-night benders, though Mitchum would later dismiss those claims with a smirk, as if being mythologized was better than being helped. What made it harder was that he functioned. Even with a bottle in his trailer and a hangover in his veins, Mitchum could deliver brilliance when it mattered. Studios saw the headlines, shrugged, and kept casting. He lived into his 70s, defying expectations. But the toll was carved deep. In his face, his health, his eyes. He once joked that he only ever acted so I could afford to get drunk in nice places. Robert Mitchum played tough, but the real fight was always with himself. And in a town full of masks, he wore his scars like a signature. Clara Bow, the it girl who party kissed a judge. In the 1920s, she was the face of modern youth, wild, magnetic, and uncontainable. But by the time Clara Bow kissed a judge in front of his wife at a studio party, the same world that had worshipped her turned on her like a switchblade. She was the original it girl. No actress before her had captured electricity the way Clara did. Her screen presence was alive. She didn't act, she glowed. Directors said she didn't need scripts. Her expressions spoke louder than words. Her laughter could shake a theater. But behind the scenes, Clara was fighting more than nerves. She came from a childhood filled with trauma, and as fame exploded around her, she found herself drowning in expectation, isolation, and a deep, quiet panic. She was barely in her 20s when the press began circling like sharks. They labeled her unruly, then unstable, then dangerous. The stories grew more outrageous, and Clara? She stopped defending herself. One infamous night, the legend goes, she arrived at a Paramount party already tipsy. The guest of honor was a newly appointed judge. Clara greeted him with a full, open-mouthed kiss right in front of his wife, then dragged him onto the dance floor. It was bold, it was chaotic, and it was the final straw for a studio already weary of her spiraling image. From there, the decline was swift. She reportedly began missing shoots. Her drinking increased. Studio handlers said she struggled to remember lines and often arrived to set visibly shaken. What once read as charming unpredictability now looked like a woman unraveling under the weight of being a product. By the early 1930s, she'd had enough. She walked away from film entirely. Her final roles went unnoticed. The spotlight dimmed, and she didn't chase it. In later years, Clara lived a quiet, reclusive life, far from the sound stages and flashing bulbs. She reportedly continued battling personal demons and was rarely seen in public again. Clara Bow wasn't ruined. She was rinsed dry by a system that fed on her spark. And when there was nothing left but the headlines and the myths, she slipped away, leaving behind the echo of a smile no one could quite forget. John Barrymore, the Shakespearean who forgot his lines. He once commanded the stage as Hamlet, his voice echoing with authority, his presence larger than life. But in his final years, John Barrymore couldn't even remember his own lines. They called him the Great Profile. He wasn't just a matinee idol, he was royalty, a Barrymore. The family name was synonymous with acting greatness, and John carried the torch with brilliance. Shakespeare flowed from him like poetry. Audiences wept, critics knelt. But as early as the 1920s, whispers began. He was missing rehearsals, slurring interviews, and often seen holding a drink when he should have been holding a script. He allegedly turned to the bottle long before Hollywood ever got to him. But once the fame hit, it gave him both the means and the excuse to keep going. Friends said he drank like he was chasing something, or maybe trying to outrun it. His performances stayed strong for a while, but the cracks spread. By the early 1930s, the decline was visible. Studios began to worry. Directors shortened his dialogue. Cue cards became necessary, then larger cue cards, then earpieces. He still had the look, still had flashes of brilliance, but the man who once recited Hamlet from memory now struggled to get through a single scene. There were moments of clarity, brief returns to form, but they were just that, moments. His health deteriorated rapidly. Years of drinking had taken their toll. Cirrhosis, kidney issues, constant fatigue. By 1942, he was reportedly living with help. His once legendary charm now softened by confusion and exhaustion. And still, people came to see him, because he was John Barrymore. Even when the lines were forgotten, the legend remained. He died that same year, at 60 years old. There was no final performance, no graceful farewell, just a quiet end to a life that had once boomed across stages like thunder. John Barrymore wasn't just an actor who lost his way. He was a monument that crumbled in slow motion. And for every actor who ever feared forgetting their lines, his story is the one they remember. Oliver Reed died after a drinking contest while filming. He played kings, warriors, and madmen. But Oliver Reed's most reckless role was the one he never left. The hard-drinking legend who could outlast anyone at the bar until he couldn't. Reed wasn't just known for his acting. He was infamous for the chaos he carried with him. Into restaurants, onto sets, and deep into the night. He once said, "I do not live in the world of sobriety." And he meant it. To him, drink wasn't a habit. It was identity. During the 1960s and 70s, Reed's performances lit up the screen. Oliver, The Devils, Women in Love. But as his talent shined, his off-screen antics grew louder. He'd reportedly show up to interviews already glassy-eyed, throw punches at reporters, or strip naked in public just to provoke a reaction. Studios rolled their eyes and wrote the checks anyway. Because he was Oliver Reed. Unpredictable, brilliant, dangerous. He didn't hide his drinking. In fact, he celebrated it. Friends joked he could drink 20 pints of beer and still recite Shakespeare. He reportedly once drank over 100 pints in a 24-hour period, a claim he never denied. But the myth caught up to the man in 1999. Reed was in Malta filming Gladiator, cast as Proximo, the gruff, philosophical slave trainer. On a break from shooting, he visited a local bar. According to witnesses, he drank multiple beers, rum, and whiskey, and challenged a group of British sailors to arm wrestle, which he reportedly won repeatedly. Shortly after, Reed collapsed. It was a heart attack. He died before the ambulance arrived. The production scrambled. His remaining scenes were completed with a body double and digital effects. When Gladiator premiered, it was dedicated to him, a tribute to the man who had made a career of intensity and died as he lived, in full tilt. There's a kind of poetry in the fact that his final role was a mentor, a man trying to guide someone else out of the arena. Oliver Reed didn't burn out quietly. He roared until the very end, and in doing so, he became what Hollywood loves most, a tragedy that looks at first glance like triumph. Tallulah Bankhead, codeine, bourbon, and a brazen life. She once walked on stage, looked at the crowd and purred, "I'm pure as the driven slush." That was Tallulah Bankhead. Fire, wit, and scandal wrapped in a fur coat. While Hollywood tried to tame its women, Tallulah never played along. She smoked cigars, swore like a sailor, and drank like she was trying to outrun something. But the price of being a woman who refused to behave was steep, and in the end, it came due. Her career began on the stage, where her deep, raspy voice and magnetic presence made her a Broadway sensation. When she crossed over into films, she brought that same audacity, stealing scenes and stirring trouble. Directors admired her talent but feared her unpredictability. Because Tallulah never separated her roles from her real life, both were fueled by defiance and bourbon. She was known to carry a flask in her handbag and a pharmacy's worth of pills in her pocket. The line between persona and pain began to blur. She reportedly struggled to stay sober through shoots, often arriving disoriented or missing entirely. Studios didn't know what to do with a woman who refused to apologize. So eventually, they stopped calling. As the roles disappeared, the bottle filled the silence. In her later years, she drank heavily, by her own admission, sometimes a quart of bourbon a day, and began mixing it with various medications. Her health declined rapidly. Friends said she never lost her wit, but she lost weight, lost balance, lost time. She once joked that her final words would be, "Codeine, bourbon." And when she passed in 1968, at the age of 66. That's exactly what she reportedly